In the Lubyanka archives, there is a folder that officially does not exist. The top-secret classification is on a file that is forbidden to be opened until the year 2034. 75 years of silence, 75 years of lies. And it all began in the cold winter of 1959, when 9 students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute went on a trek from which no one returned alive. Their leader was named Igor Dyatlov. He was 23 years old. An excellent student, a master of sports and tourism, a talented engineer. The group planned to complete a Category 3 difficulty route to Otorten Mountain in the northern Urals. A typical student trek, but something went wrong. On February 1st, the group made contact for the last time. Then silence. When rescuers found the tent on the slope of Kholat Shakal Mountain on February 26th, the scene was so strange that it defied all logic. The tent was cut from the inside, their belongings left in place. Shoes, warm clothing, everything inside. But the people had vanished in the negative 30-degree frost, as if fleeing from something invisible and deadly. The bodies began to be found gradually. First, 2 by a cedar tree, barefoot and in their underwear. Then 3 on the slope. They had tried to return to the tent. And finally, 2 months later, the last 4 were found in a ravine under 4 meters of snow. What the experts discovered defied explanation. Rib fractures without external injuries. Such injuries are sustained in high-speed car accidents. A strange orange glow to the skin, and most importantly, radiation on their clothing, exceeding the norm several times over. Investigator Lev Ivanov handled the case for 3 months, questioned dozens of witnesses, studied every detail, and on May 28th, closed the investigation with a conclusion that explained nothing. The cause of the tourists' deaths was an overwhelming elemental force which they were unable to overcome. What force? Why elemental? There were no answers. Instead, there was a direct order. Classify the case for 75 years. The order came from Nikita Khrushchev himself, the first secretary of the Central Committee of the CPSU, the man who led the country, took a personal interest in the deaths of 9 students on a deserted slope in the Ural Mountains. Why? What did Khrushchev know? And most importantly, what was he hiding? But the story does not end there. 21 years later, in 1980, when the tragedy at Dyatlov Pass was almost forgotten, an event occurred that dotted all the I's. Yuri Andropov, the chairman of the KGB of the USSR, a man who would become General Secretary 2 years later, personally appeared in the Lubyanka archives. He demanded the folder codenamed Dead Water, an operation that not even the highest circles of the KGB knew about. Andropov overstepped his authority. The chairman of the committee did not have the right to unilaterally remove files from the archives without a corresponding decision from the collegium, but he did it. The folder disappeared. With it, all traces of the operation that cost 9 young people their lives vanished. An operation in which they were not victims of chance, but participants in a state experiment. Andropov knew the truth. He didn't just know it. He was the architect of the long-standing silence. It was under him that the system of total information control was created, turning the tragedy into a state secret. And it is his name that would become the key to understanding what really happened on that cold night of February 2nd, 1959, on the slope of the cursed mountain. What was Operation Dead Water hiding? Why did 9 talented students have to die? And what price did the country pay to keep this secret? Igor Dyatlov was born on January 21, 1936, into a simple working-class family in Sverdlovsk. His father worked at a factory. His mother was a seamstress. A typical Soviet family, a typical boy, but with one exception. Igor was a genius. At 12 years old, he built his first radio receiver from parts found in a dump. At 14, he created a device to automatically turn on the lights in the entryway. Neighbors wondered where the child got such abilities. Physics teachers said they hadn't seen anything like it in 30 years of work. Igor understood technology intuitively, as if he were born with the knowledge. After school, the choice was obvious. The Ural Polytechnic Institute, the Faculty of Radio Engineering. But fate decided otherwise. In 1952, Dyatlov enrolled in the construction faculty. A strange decision for someone whose passion was electronics and radio. But the 17-year-old Igor had no choice. The construction faculty was the only one that accepted him without connections or pull. For 2 years, He studied how to build houses, received excellent grades, and participated in tourism. And then an event occurred that changed everything. In the autumn of 1954, Dyatlov was summoned to the dean's office. The conversation was short and strange. The dean said there was an opportunity to transfer to the radio engineering faculty, exactly where Igor had dreamed of going 2 years earlier. But there were conditions. What conditions? The dean did not say. He only said that a man would come who would explain everything. And the man came. A short man in a strict suit with a penetrating gaze. He did not introduce himself, showed no documents, just asked a few questions about his political views, his attitude toward the homeland, and his willingness to serve the country. Igor answered honestly. He loved the USSR, was proud of its scientific achievements, and wanted to be useful. That was enough. A week later, Dyatlov was a student in the radio engineering faculty. Officially, by transfer due to outstanding abilities. Unofficially, by recommendation of the Third Directorate of the KGB, which oversaw defense enterprises and scientific institutes. Igor did not know this. He was just happy to finally be studying his passion. In the new faculty, he got an academic advisor, Associate Professor Alexander Krivonishenko, a brilliant physicist, a specialist in radiolocation, a man with a past. In the late 1940s, Krivonishenko worked at Facility No. 2, Chelyabinsk 40, the first Soviet plant for the production of weapons-grade plutonium. A closed city, secret developments. Then he was transferred to the institute, officially, for health reasons. Unofficially, as a handler for promising students who could be useful to the military-industrial complex. Dyatlov was not Krivonishenko's only protégé. The associate professor gathered talented young people around him, gave them additional assignments, and taught them things that were not in the curriculum. Cryptography, methods of covert data transmission, working with classified information. All under the guise of a scientific circle for radio electronics. Igor was the best. He grasped things instantly, solving problems that stumped senior students. Krivonishenko told colleagues that students like this come along 1 in 1,000, and that this guy had a great future, a very great one. There were other unusual students in Dyatlov's group. Georgy Krivonishenko, the associate professor's namesake, an engineer from the atomic complex who worked at Chelyabinsk 40, and survived the terrible accident in 1957, when a container of radioactive waste exploded. Officially, he came to finish his studies after the army. Unofficially, he was a man with experience working with radiation and knowledge of how it affects the body. Rustam Slobodin, an excellent student, a master of boxing, physically strong and psychologically stable. Zinaida Kolmogorova, a radio operator, the only girl in the group who could work with long-range radio stations. Lyudmila Dubinina, a geologist by education, knew the mountains and how to navigate in any conditions. Alexander Kolovatov, a chemist, a specialist in explosives and reagents. Each of them was a professional in their field. Each had passed a special selection process, and each was connected to Dyatlov by more than just friendship, but by something bigger. They were a team that someone had very carefully formed. In 1958, Dyatlov graduated from the institute with honors, a red diploma. He was offered several jobs to choose from: scientific research institutes, design bureaus. But Igor chose the Uralmash plant, not the most prestigious option for a top student of his level. But it was there that the chief designer's department was located, which was developing guidance systems for missiles. A secret department. Access only by special permission from the KGB. Dyatlov received this clearance without any problems, as if he was already expected, as if everything had been planned in advance. And it really had been, because by that time, in the Third Directorate of the KGB, a folder codenamed Compass already existed. In it were the files of 9 people, 9 students, who were to carry out a special assignment for the homeland. An assignment they would only learn about at the very last moment. An assignment that would be their last. By the end of 1958, a permanent group of tourists had formed around Igor Dyatlov. They went on trips every month. In the summer to the mountains, in the winter, on skis through the taiga. From the outside, it seemed they were ordinary students who loved active recreation. But if one looked closer, it became clear. This group was not random. Lyudmila Dubinina was the life of the party. cheerful, energetic, always ready to support others in difficult times. But few knew that before the institute, she had worked for 3 years at a geological station in the Kibini Mountains, where classified research on radioactive ores was conducted. Lyudmila knew how to work with a dosimeter, recognized the signs of radiation sickness, and understood how to behave in zones of high radiation. Alexander Kolovatov was silent and reserved, rarely smiled, and almost never talked about himself. The other tourists considered him strange, but respected him for his professionalism. Alexander studied the chemistry of high-energy compounds. His thesis was classified, and his advisor worked at a military plant that produced rocket fuel components. A coincidence? Unlikely. Rustam Slobodin stood out for his physical fitness. A master of sports and boxing, the institute's champion. Strong, resilient, capable of acting in extreme conditions. But sports were not the main thing. Rustam served in the army in special forces. He underwent survival training for nuclear war conditions. He knew how to provide first aid for radiation exposure. Officially, he was a simple soldier in the army. Unofficially, he underwent special training for secret operations. Zenaida Kolmogorova was the only radio operator in the group with professional skills. She studied in the radio engineering faculty with Dyatlov, worked in a laboratory that tested long-range communication systems for military facilities, knew Morse code, knew how to tune transmitters, and, importantly, had clearance to work with encrypted messages. Each member of the group possessed unique skills. Each could perform specific tasks, and together they formed an ideal team for an operation that required knowledge of radio engineering, chemistry, medicine, and physical endurance. In the autumn of 1958, all participants of the future trek underwent an unusual medical commission. Usually, a note from a therapist is sufficient for student treks, but they were sent to a specialized medical center at a military hospital. There, they underwent a full examination. X-rays, blood tests, heart checks, and, strangest of all, psychological tests. The psychologist asked questions about reactions to stress, about fears, about the ability to make decisions in critical situations. One of the tests was particularly unusual. They had to describe their actions if a man-made disaster occurred, and they needed to evacuate, leaving all their belongings behind. Why such questions for a hiking trip? No one asked. Everyone received their clearance. In December, Dyatlov submitted an application for a winter trek to the Institute's sports club. The route, from the village of Ivdel, across the ridge to Otorten Mountain, and back. Category 3 difficulty. 200 kilometers through deserted taiga and mountains. The trek was planned for late January, early February, the harshest time of the Ural winter. The application was reviewed by the Route Qualification Commission. And here, the most interesting part began. The permission for the trek was signed by a certain Vladimir Ufimtsev, the chairman of the commission. But when investigators began checking the documents 2 months later, it turned out that a person with that surname had never been on the commission. The signature was real, the stamp authentic, but Ufimtsev himself did not exist. Someone very high-ranking used a false name to approve the route. Someone who had access to the Institute's stamps and documents. Someone from the state's security organs, because the Dyatlov Group's route passed through a special zone. On the maps of that time, between the mountains Kholat Syakhl and Otorten, a closed territory was marked. No explanations, just hatching and the classification, entry prohibited. The local Mansi, the indigenous people of the Urals, avoided this zone, calling Kholat Syakhl the Mountain of the Dead and saying that people disappeared there. Hunters told stories of strange flashes in the sky and a rumble heard at night. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. In this zone was a testing ground for new rocket fuel, a secret facility that not even the local military command knew about. Development was underway as part of the space program. The USSR was preparing to launch a man into space. This required powerful rockets, and powerful rockets required new fuel that would provide more energy than anything that existed before. The Americans were working on a similar project. Our intelligence reported they were close to a breakthrough. We had to beat them at any cost. Tests ran around the clock. Rocket launches were conducted in winter when the territory was deserted and the risk of information leaks was minimal. And that is exactly where the Dyatlov Group was heading. Officially, on a tourist route. Unofficially, as part of a cover operation intended to mask military tests as ordinary student activity. If American satellites detected human movement in this area, it would be explained as a hiking trip. If local residents saw anything, they would be told it was students with flashlights. But besides the official legend, there was a real task. The group members had to install radio beacons at control points along the route. These beacons helped the rocket scientists correct the flight trajectory. Dyatlov and his comrades did not know the whole truth. They were told they were helping science, that it was important for the country, that they were contributing to future space flights. They believed it, because they believed in the USSR, in the party, in a bright future. They did not know they had become pawns in a game where life was the stake, and that this game had already begun. In 1957, in the 3rd Directorate of the KGB of the USSR, a folder was created under the codename Compass. A standard gray folder with a red diagonal stripe and a top-secret classification. There were thousands of such folders in Lubyanka, but this one was special. It contained the dossiers of people who did not yet know they had become part of a secret operation. The 3rd Directorate of the KGB was engaged in military counterintelligence. It monitored defense enterprises, scientific institutes, and classified facilities. If new weapons were being developed somewhere, people from the 3rd Directorate arrived. If secret tests were planned, the operation was overseen by KGB officers. Their task was simple: prevent information leaks at any cost. The Compass folder was started after intelligence reported on American advances in creating new rocket fuel. The states planned to overtake the USSR in the space race. Our scientists were working on a response, but tests required a testing ground, remote, deserted, where launches could be conducted without attracting attention. The choice fell on the northern Urals. Taiga, mountains, minimal population, 150 kilometers to the nearest city. The man-sea rarely appeared there, an ideal place. But there was a problem. American spy satellites were already flying over the territory of the USSR. They recorded any activity in deserted areas: military equipment, construction of facilities, movement of people. All of this looked suspicious. A cover legend was needed, something natural, something that wouldn't raise questions from Western intelligence. And then the idea of using tourists was born. Student groups regularly went on treks in the Urals. This was normal, common. No suspicion. If a satellite detected people in the testing ground area, it would be explained as a tourist route. Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Timpalov was appointed as the operations handler, an experienced officer, a war veteran. He worked in Smersh military counterintelligence, and after the war, in the state security organs. Tough, calculating, intolerant of mistakes. For him, the 9 students were not people with names and fates. They were a tool to complete a task, expendable material that could be replaced if something went wrong. Timpalov began by selecting candidates. He needed students with specific skills: radio technicians, chemists, physically strong people, and, most importantly, ideologically committed, those who believed in the USSR and wouldn't ask extra questions. Files were collected through institute deaneries, Komsomol organizations, and sports clubs. By the end of 1957, the list was ready. 12 people. Backup options in case someone refused or didn't pass verification. Igor Dyatlov was at the very top of the list. Next to his name was a note: leadership qualities, technical abilities above average, recommended as group leader. But there were problems. A group of students was good for the legend. But how to control their actions? How to be sure they would complete the task and not deviate from the route? They needed a man inside the group, an experienced operative who would monitor the situation and report directly to Timpalov. In November 1958, a new instructor appeared at the Ural Polytechnic Institute's tourist club, Semyon Zolotaryov. He was 37 years old, much older than the other group members. Officially, he worked as an engineer at a plant in Sverdlovsk, was keen on tourism, had extensive experience in mountain trekking, and wanted to pass his knowledge on to the youth. Unofficially, Captain Semyon Zolotaryov was a career KGB officer. He served in military intelligence during the war, fighting in diversionary groups behind enemy lines. After the war, in the security organs, special assignments in Central Asia, in the Far East. A man with no family, no attachments, an ideal candidate for infiltration. Zolotaryov was introduced to Dyatlov as an experienced tourist who would help prepare for the difficult winter trek. Igor was pleased. Indeed, a Category 7 difficulty was serious. Extra experience wouldn't hurt. Semyon quickly integrated into the group, telling stories from his treks, teaching them how to build a fire in the snow, showing them how to properly take shelter from the wind. But in the evenings, he wrote reports. Detailed characteristics on each member, who reacted how to stress, who could make decisions in a critical situation, who was reliable, and who might show weakness. The reports were passed directly to Timpalov via a dead drop at a safe house. Each member of the group in the compass folder had an agent codename. Dyatlov was Arrow, a symbol of forward movement, leadership. Zolotaryov was Guide. His role was obvious. Kolovatov was Chemist, after his specialization. Krivonushchenko was Atom, because of his work at the nuclear facility. Slobodin was Fighter, for his physical training. Kolmogorova was Signal, for her skills as a radio operator. Dubinina was Compass. It was symbolic that her codename matched the name of the operation. In the winter of 1958, the group completed several training treks. Officially, to prepare for the main route. Unofficially, to practice the procedures for installing radio beacons. On one of the treks, they accidentally stumbled upon a military object. A sentry stopped the group, checked their documents, recorded their data, then let them go with a warning not to approach the restricted zone again. It was necessary to see how the students would behave upon contact with the military, whether panic would arise, whether they would ask extra questions. The group remained calm, apologized, said they were lost, and left. Timpalov put a checkmark in his report. They passed the test, fit for the operation. In December, the final preparations began. Dyatlov received special equipment, a late-model radio station, a theodolite for geodesic measurements, compasses with special markings. All of this was packed to look like ordinary tourist gear. But every device had a dual purpose. The group members were told the legend. They were helping geologists mark points for future surveys. They needed to install beacons at specific coordinates, photograph the area, and record instrument readings. Simple scientific work, important for the country. They would be heroes, even if no one ever found out. The students agreed with enthusiasm. It was an honor to help science, to contribute to the development of the homeland. No one wondered why they, specifically, were chosen, why the route went through a restricted zone, why such secrecy. Youth and faith in the system did not allow for doubt. On January 23, 1959, Timpalov held a final briefing with Zolotaryov. The instructions were clear. Control the group, do not allow deviations from the route, report any problems. In case of an emergency, act according to the situation. The phrase act according to the situation, in the language of the KGB, meant one thing: any means necessary to keep the operation secret. 4 days later, the group left Sverdlovsk. 10 people, 9 students and 1 KGB captain. They rode on the train, laughed, sang songs, made plans, not knowing that their route was already marked on the secret maps of Lubyanka, that their every step would be tracked, and that Operation Compass was only the beginning. Operation Dead Water awaited them, and none of them would return alive. In January 1959, in the office of General Nedelin, commander of the Strategic Missile Forces, a secret meeting took place. 15 people were present: designers, chemists, military personnel, KGB representatives. The topic was critical. The Americans had surpassed the USSR in the development of high-efficiency rocket fuel. Intelligence was reporting facts. A laboratory in the state of California had created a new formula: a fuel based on heptal with the addition of radioactive isotopes. Theoretically, it provided 40% more thrust than anything existing. This meant the ability to launch heavier satellites, deliver more cargo into orbit, and overtake us in the space race. General Nedelin was a hard man. He did not accept falling behind. When the American breakthrough was reported to him, he slammed his fist on the table and uttered the phrase that launched the operation: "We will create our own fuel better than theirs, and we will test it before they begin production." Soviet chemists had been working on a similar formula since 1957. The project was classified under the codename Dead Water. A strange name for a fuel, but it did not appear by chance. The new fuel was deadly. It contained radioactive components. Upon combustion, they left a contaminated trail. Any leak meant contaminating the territory for decades. But the efficiency was impressive. Laboratory tests showed a power increase of 52%. This was more than the Americans had. This was a breakthrough. All that remained was to conduct real-world tests, launch a rocket with the new fuel, and check how it worked in flight. The problem lay in the test site location. Existing testing grounds were unsuitable. Baikonur was too open. All the world's intelligence agencies were watching it. Kapustin Yar was near populated areas, risk of information leaks. Plesetsk was still under construction. A remote, deserted place was needed, where an experiment could be conducted in complete secrecy. The choice fell on the northern Urals. Between the settlements of Ivdel and Bermontovo was a vast territory with no military units or populated areas, only taiga and mountains. The Mansi rarely appeared there. The nearest road was 50 kilometers away, ideal conditions for a secret testing ground. Work began in the autumn of 1958. They built a temporary launch installation and brought in equipment. Everything was done covertly under the guise of geological surveys. They used helicopters that flew at night. Equipment was delivered by all-terrain vehicles over frozen rivers. No traces that could be detected by satellite. But a problem remained. A rocket launch is impossible to hide completely. The engine plume is visible for tens of kilometers. If American satellites detected a launch from this area, questions would arise. A legend was needed, an explanation that would divert suspicion. And here, Operation Compass came into play. The group of students trekking on a route through the test zone. If they were spotted by locals, it would explain the movement of people in the area. If satellites detected heat signatures, they would be written off as tourist campfires. And if something went wrong, the students would become witnesses to an accident. A tragedy in the mountains. Such things happen. The plan was cynical, but effective. Dyatlov and his group became a living shield for a military operation. They were given special tasks, disguised as scientific research. Install radio beacons at 3 control points. These beacons helped correct the rocket's trajectory. Keep a diary with records of weather and visibility. This information was needed to calculate launch conditions. Take photographs of the area. The images were used to create maps of the testing ground. The task was explained to Igor Dyatlov as helping geologists. They were told the beacons were for future expeditions, that the diary would help scientists plan work in the area, that the photographs would go into the Institute's scientific archive. He believed it. Everyone believed it. Because the alternative, to assume the homeland was using them as expendable material, was unthinkable. Each participant was given an individual task. Zinaida Kolmogorova was supposed to conduct radio interception. She was taught to tune the receiver to specific frequencies and record signals. Officially, for practice in radio engineering. Unofficially, to record the military's communications during the tests. Alexander Kolovatov was given the task of taking snow and soil samples, ostensibly for chemical composition analysis. In reality, to check for radioactive contamination if the fuel leaked. Georgy Krivonischenko, who worked at the atomic facility, was given a dosimeter, disguised as a device for measuring altitude. He was to monitor the radiation background on the route. Rustem Slobodin was assigned to monitor the group's physical condition, recording symptoms of fatigue, frostbite, or any ailment. This was preparation for possible radiation exposure. The doctors wanted to know how quickly signs of exposure would appear if something went wrong. Lyudmila Dubinina received the strangest task. She was given a special notebook with a chemical coating. If water droplets with a specific composition landed on it, the pages would change color. It was a primitive but effective way to detect chemical contamination from the rocket fuel. Semyon Zolotaryov coordinated everyone's actions, checked the completion of tasks, ensured no one guessed the true purpose of the trek, and reported every step of the group to Timpalov. On January 27, 1959, the group left Sverdlovsk. An evening train to Serov, from there to Ivdel, then by hitchhiked rides to the village of Vijay, and further on foot. 200 kilometers through the winter taiga, a 2-week journey. The return was planned for February 12th. On the day of departure, Lieutenant Colonel Timpalov sent a coded message to the testing ground command. Cover group is in motion, control established, operation initiated. The testing ground received the message and began final preparations for launch. The rocket with the deadwater fuel was scheduled to launch on February 2nd. It was on this exact day that the Dyatlov group was supposed to be on the slope of Kholat Shakal mountain. It was precisely there that the coordinates for the installation of the last radio beacon were located. A coincidence? No. calculation. A cold and precise calculation by military strategists, for whom 9 lives were worth less than the success of the operation. Less than victory over America in the space race. Less than the ambitions of generals and the secrecy of the project. The group rode on the train, suspecting nothing. They sang songs, joked, dreamed of summits, not knowing that a one-way ticket had already been purchased, that Operation Deadwater would be their last, and that in a week, their names would go down in history as the greatest mystery of the USSR. On January 28th, the group reached the village of Vijay, the last point of civilization before the taiga. A small logging settlement with a dozen houses, a shop, and the lumber office. Here, Dyatlov registered the route with the local administration, a formality required by the rules, but an entry appeared in the log. 10 people. Route to Otorten Mountain. Return February 12th. The last documented proof that the group existed. That same day, Yuri Yudin left the group. The official reason: a flare-up of radiculitis. The pain in his lower back was so severe that he could not continue the trek. Igor made the decision to leave his comrade in the village. Yudin was to return to Sverdlovsk on his own. 9 people went on. Years later, Yudin would say that his illness saved him, that if it weren't for the radiculitis, he would have died with the others. But were the pains real? Or was this a way to remove one person from the group before the dangerous phase of the operation began? In Yudin's KGB file, there is a short note: departure authorized. Authorized by whom? Who decided that one of the 10 should remain alive? On the morning of January 29th, the 9 tourists moved north. According to the map, the route looked simple: along the Lozva River to an abandoned geologist camp. From there, on skis over the pass to Kolatsyakal Mountain, then to Otterten, and back. On paper, 200 kilometers. In reality, a path to nowhere. The first 3 days passed calmly. The weather held, -25 frost, but no wind. The group moved according to plan. In the evenings, they set up camp, prepared dinner, recorded the temperature and visibility in the diary. Dyatlov took photographs. Everything looked like a normal tourist trek. But Zolotaryov kept his own records. Every evening he would walk off into the woods, ostensibly to relieve himself. In reality, he was transmitting radiograms via a portable transmitter. Briefly, in code. Day 1, normal. Day 2, normal. Day 3, normal. The messages were received at the testing ground's temporary base. Timpalov tracked the group's progress on a map. 9 dots were moving toward their destination. On February 1st, the group reached the abandoned geologist camp, a few dilapidated barracks where workers used to live. They decided to make a day camp here, leave some of their food and excess gear, and lighten their packs before the mountain ascent. A logical decision. But there was another reason. In one of the barracks, under the floor, was a concealed radio station, more powerful than Zolotaryov's portable transmitter. It had been installed in advance by KGB operatives under the guise of geodesic equipment. The station was supposed to receive signals from the radio beacons the group would install and transmit the coordinates to the testing ground to correct the rocket's trajectory. Zinaida Kolmogorova and Igor Dyatlov spent 2 hours in the barracks, officially sorting provisions, unofficially calibrating the radio station, tuning frequencies, checking the connection. Kolmogorova worked with the codes, Dyatlov with the antenna. They did this under the guise of repairing a geodesic instrument supposedly left by geologists. When the work was finished, an incident occurred. Georgy Krivonishchenko decided to check the equipment's condition. He got too close to the operating transmitter. The powerful radio signal created an electrical discharge. The shock was not fatal, but it was painful. Georgy was thrown back a meter. He fell, losing consciousness for a few seconds. The group ran over at the cries. Krivonishchenko recovered slowly, complaining of chest pain and numbness in his arms, signs of electrical trauma. Rustem Slobodin, who had medical training, examined the victim. Pulse rapid, breathing shallow. He needed rest, preferably a return to the village and a doctor's examination. But Zolotaryov insisted on continuing the trek. He said Gorgy had just bruised himself in the fall, that it wasn't serious, that it would pass in a day. Dyatlov hesitated, but the senior comrade, the experienced tourist, the man he trusted, was persuasive. They couldn't interrupt the route because of a bruise. The group couldn't let the institute down. The scientific tasks had to be completed. Igor yielded, making the decision to go on. Krivonishenko himself said he felt better, that he could continue, that he didn't want to let his comrades down. In Soviet times, refusing an assignment was tantamount to betrayal. To be the weakling who derailed the common cause was shameful, Georgy went on, although his heart was already damaged. That same evening, Zolotaryov sent a coded message to the testing ground. Incident with Atom, minor injury, operation continues. Timpalov received the message and decided not to interrupt the launch preparations. One injured participant was not critical to completing the mission. The radio beacons could be installed without him. The main group had to be in place on February 2nd. On the morning of February 2nd, the group began the ascent up the slope of Kholat-Syakhl mountain. The weather deteriorated sharply. The wind picked up, a blizzard began. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The temperature dropped to -35 degrees, but there was no turning back. According to the plan, they had to install the last radio beacon right here. Today. The group moved slowly. Deep snow, a strong headwind. Krivonishenko lagged behind, complaining of weakness, and fell twice. His comrades helped him up, but there was no time to lose. By evening, they needed to install the beacon and set up camp. By 5 o'clock in the evening, they reached the installation point. The coordinates matched those in the assignment. Dyatlov and Kolovatov installed the radio beacon, camouflaged it with stones, and activated the transmitter. The signal went out. The testing ground received confirmation. The last control point was activated. They could prepare for launch. The group began to set up the tent. The location was poor, an open slope, the wind knocking them off their feet. But they didn't have the strength to descend lower into the forest. They decided to spend the night here and continue in the morning. They set up the tent quickly, climbed inside, lit the Primus stove, and began preparing dinner. No one knew that 20 kilometers away from them, the military was preparing a rocket for launch, that in 3 hours the sky would be lit by a flash brighter than the sun, that their lives were entering their final hours, and that Operation Dead Water would turn from a fuel test into an operation to cover up a catastrophe. The clocks showed 8 o'clock in the evening. At the testing ground, the final countdown began. In the tent on the slope of Kholat-Syakhl, 9 people were eating dinner and making plans for tomorrow, not suspecting that tomorrow would not come, that in an hour everything would change, and that this evening would be the last calm moment of their lives. At 9 o'clock in the evening on February 2nd, at the temporary testing ground 20 kilometers from the Kholat-Syakhl slope, the final countdown began. The R-5M rocket with the experimental dead water fuel stood on the launch installation. 20 meters of steel and deadly chemistry. Inside the tanks, the fuel that was supposed to change the space race, fuel that no one had ever tested in a real flight. General Nedelin watched the preparations through binoculars from a bunker 3 kilometers from the launch. Nearby stood the designers, military men, and KGB representatives. Everyone understood the gravity of the moment. If the fuel worked, the USSR would overtake America. If not, they would have to start over. Losing was not an option. Lieutenant Colonel Timpalov received the final confirmation from Zolotaryov. The group was in place. The beacon was active, ready to receive data. Everything was going according to plan. The rocket was supposed to ascend to a height of 10,000 meters, fly on a trajectory over the mountain slope, and fall into the deserted taiga 50 kilometers away. The radio beacons installed by the Dyatlov group were supposed to track the trajectory and transmit data for analysis. In the tent on the slope, it was calm. They had finished dinner. Dyatlov was writing the day's events in the diary. Kolmogorova was tuning the radio receiver for the morning communication. Krivonishenko lay in his sleeping bag, complaining of a headache. The others were preparing for sleep, a normal evening on a trek. Fatigue, anticipation of the next day, jokes before bed. No one was looking at the sky, no one was expecting a catastrophe. At 9:23, the ignition command sounded at the testing ground. The rocket's engine roared to life with a sound that spread through the taiga for tens of kilometers. The plume of flame lit the sky brighter than the moon. The rocket began to rise. Slowly at first, then faster, it gained altitude, 1,000 meters, 2,000, 3,000. The trajectory was correct. Everything was proceeding normally. But at an altitude of 8,000 meters, the one thing everyone had feared happened. The experimental fuel proved unstable at low temperatures, minus 60 degrees at altitude. It triggered a chemical reaction. The fuel began to decompose inside the tank. The pressure rose beyond the critical mark. The automated systems didn't have time to react. An explosion lit up the sky for 100 kilometers around. The rocket was torn to pieces. A cloud of incandescent gas, metal fragments, and radioactive fuel unfurled in the sky like a mushroom. The shock wave echoed through the mountains like a peal of thunder. And then the rain of death began. Burning drops of fuel fell to the earth. Thousands of drops, millions. They glowed with an orange light, falling onto the snow, melting it, falling onto the trees, setting the bark on fire, falling onto the slope of Mount Kolatsyakhl, where a tent stood with 9 people inside. Zolotarev was the first to hear the explosion. He was an operative. He had reflexes. He understood what had happened before the others and shouted, "Everyone out! Immediately!" But there was no time to explain. Seconds meant life and death. Dyatlov grabbed a knife and slashed the tent. The fabric tore from top to bottom. There was no time to find the exit through the zipper. No time to get dressed. No time to grab belongings, only to get out, to run as far as possible from this place. They burst out into the frost in whatever they were wearing. Some in their underwear. Some in just a jacket without pants. Some barefoot. The frost was below zero. The wind knocked them off their feet, but the cold was not the most terrifying thing. The sky above them was blazing. Fiery drops were falling all around, hissing on the snow. The air smelled of chemicals and burnt metal. Smoke covered the slope. And the most awful part, their skin began to burn. Not from the fire, but from an invisible radiation that pierced their bodies through and through. Zolotarev shouted, "To the forest! Run to the forest!" He knew it was radiation. He knew they had to get as far as possible from the affected zone, that every second on the slope was an additional dose of radiation, that they couldn't delay. The group ran down the slope, stumbling, falling, getting up, falling again. 1.5 kilometers to the forest. 1.5 kilometers through deep snow in the dark. Barefoot, undressed, under a rain of radioactive fallout. Kolmogorova was the first to lose consciousness, falling face down in the snow. Slobodin stopped to help, tried to lift her, but she was too heavy. He could barely stand on his own feet. He yelled to Dyatlov, "Zina can't walk!" Igor turned around. He saw 2 others lagging behind, realized the group was splitting up. Zolotarev was ahead. He was running faster than everyone, not looking back, following the KGB order to save himself at all costs, because he was a carrier of information about the operation. His life was more important than the others. That's how he was taught. That's how the system worked. Only 7 made it to the forest. Dyatlov, Krivonishenko, Doroshenko, Dubinina, Zolotarev, Kolovatov, Thibaut Brignol. 2 remained on the slope, Kolmogorova and Slobodin, who had tried to help her. It was slightly warmer in the forest. The trees protected them from the wind, but the frost was still killing them. They needed a fire. Urgently. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko began to gather branches. Their hands wouldn't obey. Their fingers were numb, but they broke branches, dragged them to a large cedar, and tried to start a fire with matches that had miraculously ended up in Georgie's jacket pocket. The first signs of radiation sickness appeared quickly. Nausea hit everyone at the same time, vomiting, dizziness. The skin on their faces and hands began to turn red, as if from a severe sunburn. Dubinina complained of pain in her eyes, seeing everything as if in a fog. The radiation was damaging her cornea. Krivonishenko was the worst off. An electric shock during the day had damaged his heart, and the radiation finished off his body. He sat by the cedar, leaning against the trunk, breathing heavily, coughing up blood, understanding he was dying, whispering, "Forgive me, it's my fault. I didn't check the equipment." Dyatlov tried to contact the test site by radio. Zolotarev's portable station had miraculously survived, but there was only silence on the air. No one answered, because there was panic at the test site. The rocket's explosion meant the operation had failed, meant the territory was contaminated, meant they needed to urgently cover their tracks. Timpalov gave the order to cease all contact with the cover group, to evacuate the test site personnel. to initiate the decontamination protocol. Dyatlov's group was abandoned, written off, erased from the operation. They had become witnesses to a catastrophe, and witnesses are not needed in such matters. Zolotarev understood this first. He understood that help would not come, that they had been left to die in the taiga, that the operation had failed and now they were a problem that needed to be eliminated. He was a KGB operative. He knew the rules, knew that the system does not forgive failure, and that 9 corpses in the taiga are easier to explain than 9 witnesses to a catastrophe. The fire wouldn't start, the branches were damp, the matches ran out, the cold was reaching their bones. Doroshenko was the first to lose consciousness. He fell by the cedar, not breathing. Georgy Krivonishenko tried to perform artificial respiration, but he himself was too weak. 5 minutes later, he died too. 2 by the cedar, frozen in the poses of their last attempt to survive. The remaining 7 understood. Death is in the forest. We must return to the tent. There are things, clothes, sleeping bags. Maybe there is still a chance. Dyatlov made the decision to split up. The 3 strongest would go for the things. 4 would remain in the forest, try to build a fire from the clothes of the deceased. This was Igor Dyatlov's last decision. The last order from the group leader. A decision that divided them into those who would die on the slope and those who would die in the ravine. But the result was predetermined. The radiation had already done its job. Their bodies had received a lethal dose. They had hours left, maybe a day, but no more. Operation Dead Water had turned into Operation Dead People, and the night had only just begun. Igor Dyatlov stood by the cedar and looked at the bodies of his comrades. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko lay in the snow, motionless, frozen, dead. 2 out of 9. And this was only the beginning. The rest would also die if he didn't act immediately. The decision was difficult. Splitting up a group in the mountains in winter violates all hiking rules. But there was no other choice. 4 were too weak to climb the slope. Radiation sickness was progressing rapidly. Lyudmila Dubinina was almost blind. Her eyes were swollen and tears were streaming. Alexander Kolovatov couldn't breathe properly. His lungs were damaged by the radioactive dust he had inhaled while fleeing. Nicolas Thibault Brignol complained of a severe headache. It felt like his skull was splitting from the inside. Zolotarev was just silent, sitting by a tree and staring into the void, understanding that the end was near. Dyatlov told them, "We will go to the tent, bring clothes, sleeping bags, everything we can. You try to start a fire, take the clothes off Yuri and Georgy. They don't need warmth anymore. We will be back in 2 hours at most." Rustem Slobodin and Zenaida Kolmogorova went with him. Those who could still walk. Those who had the strength to climb 1.5 kilometers up the slope. They took the jackets and sweaters from the deceased, put them on their bare bodies. It was little, but better than nothing. The ascent turned into a nightmare. Deep snow, a headwind, darkness, and the radiation that still hung in the air like a cloud of invisible death. Every step was a struggle. Every breath burned their lungs. Their bodies refused to obey. Their muscles cramped, but they kept going, because their comrades remained below, because to give up meant to die. Zenaida fell first, after 300 meters from the cedar. She just stopped, swayed, and collapsed into the snow. Dyatlov and Slobodin tried to lift her, shook her, called her name, slapped her cheeks, but she didn't react. Her pulse was weak, her breathing shallow, her heart was failing. The radiation poisoning had reached her vital organs. Igor understood that dragging her further was pointless. She would die on the way, or was already dying. He had to keep going, to manage to bring help to the others. He covered Zina with the jacket he had taken from the deceased Doroshenko, whispered, "I'm sorry. I'll come back for you." And he moved on with Rustem. After another 400 meters, Slobodin fell. He tripped on a rock under the snow and hit his head. He couldn't get up, lay on his side, holding his head. Blood flowed from his nose, staining the snow red. His skull had fractured from the impact. But that wasn't what was killing Rustem. The radiation was destroying his brain from within. The hemorrhage was just the final straw. Dyatlov was left alone. He looked at his comrade and understood. There was no one left to go on. He was the last one who could move, the last one who could reach the tent. But his strength was running out. His legs wouldn't hold him. His head was spinning. His vision was doubling. Igor took another 20 steps, 30, 40, fell, got up, crawled. Another 10 meters, another 5. And he realized he wouldn't make it. The tent was 300 meters away, so close. But those 300 meters had become an insurmountable chasm. He lay face down in the snow, closed his eyes. His last thought was, "I'm sorry, Mom. I couldn't do it." Igor Dyatlov's heart stopped on the slope of Mount Kolatsyakhl at 1:30 in the morning on February 3rd. He was 23 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him, but Operation Dead Water took it away, just as it took the lives of the others. In the forest, the four awaited the return of their comrades. They waited 1 hour, 2, 3. The sky began to lighten with dawn, but Dyatlov did not return. No one returned. Lyudmila Dubinina whispered, "They're not coming. We've been abandoned. Everyone is dead." Zolotarev tried to contact the test site one last time, transmitted a distress signal on the air, briefly, in Morse code. SOS. Everyone is dying. Radiation. Help. There was no answer, only the crackle of static. The system had definitively abandoned them. By morning, the four decided to go deeper into the forest, find a ravine where they could shelter from the wind, dig a den in the snow, warm each other, and hold on for at least one more day. Maybe they would be found, maybe they would be rescued. The naive hope of dying people. They found a ravine 150 meters from the cedar, deep, protected from the wind. They lined the bottom with fir branches, lay down next to each other, huddled together, covered themselves with the remnants of clothing, and began to die. Acute radiation sickness gives no chance of survival. The body is destroyed from within. Blood vessels burst, internal organs fail, bones become brittle. Lyudmila Dubinina's heart failed first. She died at 6 o'clock in the morning. An hour later, Nicholas Thibault Brignol suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. His skull fractured from the pressure. Alexander Kolovatov's lungs filled with blood. He suffocated on his own blood. Semyon Zolotarev was the last. The KGB captain, the operative, the man who had led the group to their deaths while following orders. He lay in the snow grave and thought about how the system he served had killed him just as cold-bloodedly as he himself had carried out orders to eliminate undesirables. The irony of fate. The executioner had become the victim. He died at 8:30 in the morning on February 3rd, the last of the 9. Operation Compass was complete. All participants were dead. There were no witnesses to the catastrophe left. But at the very moment Zolotarev was dying, a convoy of military trucks approached the base of Mount Kolatsyakhl. 6 vehicles, 40 people in protective suits, dosimetrists, chemists, KGB officers. The cleanup operation had begun. The operation was led by Colonel Yevgeny Maslenikov, an experienced officer, a war veteran, a man who knew how to follow orders without unnecessary questions. His task was clear. Find the bodies, decontaminate the area, remove all traces of radioactive contamination, and create a cover story about an accident in the mountains. The group worked quickly and professionally. Dosimetrists went over the slope, recorded the zones of high radiation, marked them on a map. Chemists sprayed a special solution that neutralized radioactive isotopes on the snow's surface. The military collected the rocket fragments that had fallen near the tent, packed them in lead containers, and took them away. The tent was found quickly, cut open, covered in snow. Inside were belongings, food, documents. Everything was saturated with radiation. Maslenikov gave the order to take the most contaminated items, replace them with clean ones, and leave only what looked natural for a tourist camp. Clothing with high levels of radiation was replaced with similar items. Dyatlov's diary was confiscated. Another one was planted in its place, where the last entries were innocuous. The cameras were taken. The film was developed later, cutting out the frames with military objects and strange flashes in the sky. They decided not to touch the bodies, let them lie where they fell. The official search operation would only begin in 3 weeks. By that time, the radiation levels would have dropped, the decontamination would have done its job. The experts would find nothing, or they would find what they were allowed to find. Maslenikov personally checked every detail of the operation, made sure that no traces of military presence remained, that the legend of the hikers' deaths from a natural force would look plausible, that no expert could prove a man-made disaster had occurred here. By the evening of February 3rd, the convoy had left. The slope of Kolatsyakhl was deserted once again. 9 bodies lay in the snow, waiting to be found. waiting for the official investigation to begin. An investigation that would be a sham from the first word to the last. And in Moscow, in an office at Lubyanka, Lieutenant Colonel Timpalov was writing a report for the highest leadership of the KGB. Operation failed. Test aborted due to an accident. Cover group eliminated. Territory cleared. Recommend classifying the case for a period of no less than 75 years. Appoint a formal investigation with a predetermined outcome. The report was approved, moved higher up to Nikita Khrushchev. The first secretary read it and wrote his resolution. Agreed. Classify the case. Eliminate the witnesses. Simple words. But behind them lay the fates of people who did not yet know their deaths had been signed off on. The operation to conceal the truth was just beginning. Ahead lay months of a sham investigation, years of silence, decades of lies, and the name of Yuri Andropov, the man who would turn the concealment of truth into an art. But more on that in the next parts of the story. On February 26, 1959, panic began in Sverdlovsk. The Dyatlov group had not made contact. The deadline for their return had long passed. Relatives were overwhelming the institute's phone lines, demanding a search be started. The dean's office tried to calm them, saying delays happen on hikes. Maybe they changed their route. Maybe they were stuck due to weather. Wait a few more days. But the parents were not calming down. Lyudmila Dubinina's father went to the district party committee, declared that if a search didn't begin immediately, he would raise a scandal across the entire region. This worked. On February 22nd, an official search group was created. It was headed by Yevgeny Maslenikov, the very same colonel who had led the cleanup on the Kolat-Syakhl slope 3 weeks earlier. A coincidence? No. A calculation. Maslenikov knew where the bodies lay, knew what needed to be found, knew how to organize the search so that everything looked natural. He was the ideal candidate to lead a show operation to rescue people who were already long dead. The search group set out on February 23rd. Student volunteers, military personnel, local hunters, 40 people in all. They followed Dyatlov's route, checking every winter hut, every camp. Maslenikov skillfully directed the search, deliberately slowing their progress. Time was needed. Time for the radiation levels to finally drop. Time for the traces of the cleanup to disappear under new snow. On February 26th, the tent was found. A student, Mikhail Sharavin, was the first to see it on the slope, shouting, "There it is! We found it!" The group climbed to the site. The scene was shocking. The tent was cut from the inside. Belongings were in place. The people had vanished. Maslenikov immediately took control of the situation, forbade touching anything until the investigator arrived, posted a guard, and sent a radiogram to Sverdlovsk. Dyatlov group's tent discovered. No people. Circumstances are suspicious. Investigative team required. That same day, senior prosecutor Lev Ivanov flew in from Sverdlovsk, a young major of justice, 32 years old, ambitious, a believer in justice and the law, a man who did not yet understand he had entered a game where the rules were set by the KGB. Ivanov began the investigation by all the rules. He inspected the tent, documented the cuts, described the position of the items, drew a diagram of the scene, then gave the order to search for the people. The logic was simple. If they left the tent, they must have gone somewhere, most likely down, towards the forest. 2 days later, they found the first bodies. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko by the cedar. Barefoot in their underwear. Dead, in a pose as if they were trying to start a fire. Ivanov was stunned. What had forced people to flee a tent undressed into a -30-degree frost? What threat was so terrible that they preferred to freeze to death? 5 days later, they found Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin on the slope. They lay 300 to 400 meters apart from each other, faces turned towards the tent, as if trying to return. Ivanov began to form theories. An avalanche? But there were no signs of an avalanche. Panic from something? But from what? The bodies were sent for autopsy to the Sverdlovsk morgue. The forensic medical expert, Boris Vozrozdeny, conducted the examination and discovered strange things. All 5 had signs of hypothermia. That was expected. But there were other symptoms: a strange orange tint to the skin, brittle hair, hemorrhages in the internal organs. Slobodin had a skull fracture without external injuries. Vozrozhdeny began to write his conclusion, but 2 days later, men in civilian clothes came to him, without introductions, without documents. They said briefly, "Your conclusion must contain only the cause of death, hypothermia, no other symptoms. Understood?" Vozrozhdeny tried to object. This was a violation of professional ethics, falsification of a medical document, but they explained it more simply. Either he writes what is required, or his career ends here and now. And perhaps not just his career. The doctor complied. The official conclusion stated, "Death occurred as a result of general hypothermia of the body." He crossed everything else out. The orange skin color was not mentioned. The hemorrhages were attributed to the pressure of the snow. The skull fracture was explained by a fall on rocks. But the most terrifying part began when they found the last 4 in the ravine in May, under 4 meters of snow. The bodies were in horrific condition. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue and eyes. Zolotarev was missing his eyes. Thibaut Brignol's skull was crushed from the inside. Dubinina and Zolotarev had multiple fractured ribs without damage to the soft tissues. Vozrozhdeny wrote in his conclusion, "Injuries of this nature are possible only from the impact of an immense force. Similar injuries are observed in victims of high-speed car accidents. But what could create such a force in the forest? The impact of a tree? But the injuries were symmetrical, as if the chest had been squeezed by a press. An avalanche? But the clothing was intact, no signs of snow pressure. And then the laboratory provided the results of the clothing analysis. Radioactivity was detected on Dubinina's sweater and Krivonishenko's jacket. The background level was exceeded several times over. The official conclusion stated, possible contamination from natural radioactive sources in the soil. But the expert who conducted the analysis told Ivanov personally, "This is not a natural background. These are isotopes that are formed during nuclear reactions." Lev Ivanov felt the investigation was moving beyond a simple accident. He requested additional expertise, wanted to invite specialists from Moscow, but was refused. Moreover, a KGB representative came to him, General Pyotr Ivashutin, head of the main intelligence directorate, a man from the highest echelon of power. The conversation was short. Ivashutin said, "Major Ivanov, you are a good investigator, you have a great future. But this case is not for career growth. This case is for a quick closure. You will write the conclusion. The group died from an overwhelming natural force. No additional expertise, no further investigations. The case is closed, classified, and you will forget about it forever." Ivanov tried to object, spoke of an investigator's duty, of the search for truth, of justice. Ivashutin listened silently, then pulled out a folder, opened it, showed him photographs. The pictures were of Ivanov's family, his wife, his 2 children. Next, a photo of his parents in their village. The general said, "You have a wonderful family. You want them to live long and happily? Then close the case. No questions." The threat was clear. Ivanov understood. He had encountered something greater than the law, greater than justice, greater than human lives. The system was protecting a secret, and it was ready to eliminate anyone who tried to uncover it. The major broke. On May 28, 1959, he signed the order to close the criminal case. The document stated, "The cause of the hikers' deaths was an overwhelming natural force, which they were unable to overcome." No clarifications, no details. Just a vague formulation that concealed the truth about a military catastrophe. The case was sealed, given the top-secret classification, and placed in the special archives of the KGB. Only 3 people had access. The chairman of the KGB, Alexander Shelepin, General Ivashutin, and Lieutenant Colonel Timpalov. All materials that pointed to radiation, an explosion, and military tests were removed. In their place, neutral documents were filed. Interrogation protocols where witnesses talked about meteorological conditions and the difficulty of the route. Later, investigator Ivanov tried to clear his conscience. He invented a version about fireballs. Allegedly, on the night of the group's death, local residents had seen strange glowing objects in the sky. This version was meant to be a compromise, to explain the unusual circumstances, but not reveal the military secret. The balls could be anything: meteorites, the northern lights, an optical effect. The main thing was that they weren't rockets with radioactive fuel. But even this version was not included in the official documents. It was too dangerous. Any clue could lead to an investigation. It was better to just leave it as a natural force. Let people think what they want. An avalanche, a hurricane, panic, anything but the truth. The 9 students were buried in Sverdlovsk. Closed caskets, short speeches about heroes who died conquering nature. Families wept, friends didn't understand what had happened, and the system was already erasing the traces, destroying the evidence, preparing for long years of silence. And ahead was the man who would turn this silence into an absolute. Yuri Andropov, the future chairman of the KGB, the future general secretary, the man who would make the Dyatlov case the most guarded secret of the USSR. But more on that in the final part of the story. In 1967, Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov became the chairman of the Committee for State Security, KGB, of the USSR. He was 53 years old. Behind him was a career as a diplomat, a party functionary, a man who knew how to solve problems quietly and effectively. His appointment marked the beginning of a new era for the KGB, an era of total control over information, an era when state secrets were guarded more fiercely than the gold in the Kremlin's vaults. Andropov came to the KGB with a clear task: to strengthen the system, make it impenetrable, turn the security organs into a machine that does not fail. And one of his first tasks was to deal with cases that could become a threat to the state's reputation. The Dyatlov case was at the very top of the list. The new chairman requested all materials on the pass, studied every page, read Timpolov's reports, reviewed the results of the cleanup, looked at the photographs that were never shown to the public, and understood. This case couldn't just be classified. It needed to be buried so deep that no one could ever dig up the truth. Andropov created a multi-level system of information protection. The first level, official archives. The Dyatlov case was there, but under the top-secret classification and with restricted access. The second level, the KGB Special Archive. This held the real materials: photographs with radiation readings, reports on the cleanup, data on Operation Dead Water. The third level, the chairman's personal safe. This held documents that officially did not exist. But Andropov understood. Archives can be breached. Safes can be cracked. The real protection is the elimination of witnesses, the people who knew the truth, the people who could talk. In 1969, a secret folder was created, codenamed Liquidation of Dyatlov Witnesses. It contained a list of 27 names: military personnel who worked at the test site, chemists who developed the fuel, radio operators who received signals from the group, doctors who saw the real autopsy results, investigators who knew more than they should. These people were not eliminated immediately. That would be too noticeable. They were eliminated gradually. Accidents, heart attacks, suicides, car crashes. Over 15 years, out of the 27 people on the list, only 3 remained alive. And all 3 received a clear warning: silence until the end of your life. Otherwise, an accident will happen to you too. Investigator Lev Ivanov lived the longest, dying in 1992. Before his death, he gave an interview to a newspaper. He said he was forced to close the case, that he saw strange things he couldn't explain, mentioned fireballs and radiation, but he didn't say the main thing. He didn't name Operation Dead Water, didn't talk about the military tests. The fear was too deep in him, even 30 years after the events. Forensic expert Boris Vozrojdeny lived to be 81. He suffered from his conscience all his life, knew he had signed false conclusions, that he had betrayed his professional ethics, but he remained silent. In 1998, shortly before his death, he told a journalist, "What I saw on the bodies of the Dyatlov group cannot be explained by hypothermia, but I was forbidden to write the truth." Who forbade you? Those one cannot disobey. He added nothing more. He died a month later. A heart attack, quick, as if someone had hurried nature along. But the most important event in the history of the cover-up was 1980. Andropov was at the peak of his power, had controlled the KGB for 13 years, was preparing to become general secretary, and decided to finally clean up the traces of Operation Dead Water. In March of that year, he personally arrived at the Lubyanka archives, demanded the folder with the operation's materials. The archive staff tried to explain, such documents are removed only by a decision of the KGB Collegium. A request must be filed, signatures collected, procedure followed. Andropov said coldly, "I am the procedure. Give me the folder." They brought it to him. A thick folder with the "of special importance" classification. Inside was the complete history of the operation. From planning to catastrophe, from the group's death to the cleanup. Names, dates, coordinates, photographs. Everything that could reveal the truth. Andropov took the folder and left. He violated all instructions, exceeded his authority. But who would dare stop the chairman of the KGB? Who would dare ask why he needed these documents? The folder disappeared. It was not in the archives, not in the special repository. Only an entry in the log. Withdrawn by the chairman, not subject to return. What did Andropov do with it? Destroy it? Hide it in his personal safe? Give it to someone for final destruction? No one knows. But the fact remains. After 1980, not a single official document existed that linked the deaths of the Dyatlov group to military tests. Andropov became General Secretary in 1982. He ruled for only 15 months, dying in February 1984. But in those months, he managed to give one last order regarding the Dyatlov case. Extend the classification until 2034, 75 years from the moment of the tragedy. He wanted to be sure that the truth would not come out in his lifetime, or even after his death. But there were people who tried to speak. Yuri Yudin, the only surviving member of the hike, gave interviews all his life. Spoke of the strange preparations of the group, of unusual assignments, of the route passing through a restricted zone. But he had no serious proof, only memories and conjectures. Yudin died in 2013. Old age, illnesses. But before his death, he said, "I always knew they weren't killed by nature. They were killed by the system. But it's impossible to prove." Mikhail Sherevin, the student who first found the tent, tried to investigate the case on his own, collected testimonies, interviewed witnesses. In 2001, men in civilian clothes came to him, without introduction, told him to stop digging into the past, or there would be problems. A month later, Sherevin was in a car accident. He survived by a miracle. He never spoke of the Dyatlov case again. Gennady Karelin, a member of the search party, kept a diary with notes about what he saw on the slope. Strange tracks in the snow, the unusual skin color of the deceased, the smell of chemicals in the air. In 2008, his apartment was burglarized. Only one thing was stolen: the diary. Money, valuables, electronics were left untouched. Karelin understood the hint, fell silent. The authorities, meanwhile, created an illusion of openness. In the 90s, they announced the case was declassified, opened access to some of the materials. Journalists and researchers received documents, rejoiced. Finally, the truth would come out. But they quickly realized they were only given what didn't matter. Protocols of witness interrogations, descriptions of weather conditions, maps of the area. Nothing about radiation, nothing about military tests, nothing about Operation Dead Water. The most important documents remained classified. In 2009, the authorities stated, full declassification will occur in 2034, 75 years after the tragedy. Exactly as long as Andropov had ordered. But even when that deadline passes, the truth is unlikely to come out, because the most dangerous documents have already been destroyed. The witnesses are dead. The evidence has vanished. All that remains are theories, conjectures, and the stories of people whom no one believes. Operation Dead Water became the perfect crime. 9 people died for the sake of a secret experiment. Their deaths were covered up, their sacrifice devalued, their memory turned into a conspiracy legend that skeptics laugh at and enthusiasts debate. And the truth remained where Yuri Andropov buried it, in archives that will never be opened, in safes that will never be cracked, in the minds of people who were forced to be silent forever. The system won, the truth lost. And 9 young lives became the price for a state secret that is more important than human fates, more important than justice, more important than memory. Kholat Shachel in Mansi means Mountain of the Dead. The local inhabitants knew this long before 1959. It was as if the mountain was waiting for its victims, as if fate was predetermined, and the 9 students, who believed in a bright future and loved their country, became part of the darkness that this country so diligently hides. Their story is not just a tragedy. It is a lesson about how a state can sacrifice its citizens for its ambitions, how a system can destroy innocent people and call it a necessity, how truth can be buried so deep that it is never found. The Dyatlov Pass remains a mystery, but it is not a mystery of nature. It is a mystery of human cruelty, of cold calculation, of a state machine that grinds up lives and leaves no traces. And as long as the archives are closed, as long as the witnesses are silent, as long as the system protects its secrets, the truth will remain where it was buried, on the slope of Kolatsyakhl, along with the 9 souls who never learned that they were victims of an operation codenamed Dead Water. This material represents a work of historical fiction and investigative journalism with elements of alternative history. All described events, dialogues, and situations are an artistic interpretation of historical facts and do not claim to be documentarily accurate. Any resemblance to real events is purely speculative.